way of introduction, my name's Jess Northend. I'm a policy lead at the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change. And we're going to be spending roughly the next 60 minutes talking about the hugely exciting field of precision mental health with a frankly incredible panel who I will turn and introduce in just a second. Before we kick in, I just wanted to reaffirm some of the comments that have been made this morning around the difficulty that so many people have, both in the UK, in the US, and in so many other countries, accessing mental health support. And when they do, often they end up cycling in and out of treatments, struggling to find the right one that works for them. But precision mental health is emerging as a new approach that combines functional neuroimaging with cognitive, behavioral, and physiological measures. It could enable clinicians to identify which patients will respond to specific treatments, in turn helping personalize mental health, which is an incredibly exciting prospect. Now, at the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change, we're focused on helping governments address some of the biggest challenges that they face, and mental health is frankly at the top of the list for many internationally. And so we're hugely excited about this emerging field and very much looking forward to talking a little bit more about the research, the brilliant work of our panelists, and also how we can start to bring this work to policymakers and support its growth. So with that, I'm going to turn to a couple of introductions. So I'm going to start with Jyoti. Jyoti Mishra is the founder of Neat Labs at UCSD. Her lab innovates digital technologies for scalable brain health mapping, monitoring, and precision therapeutics. It specifically aims to advance the understanding of the neurocognitive circuits across our lifespans and applies neural engineering methods to stimulate brain plasticity and change behavior. Next up, Leanne Williams is the founding director of the Stanford Center for Precision Mental Health and Wellness. Dr. Williams leads the center's PanLab for precision psychiatry and translational neuroscience, which has developed a radical new way to understand and treat mental health disorders based on a personalized approach to neuroscience. She also has a joint position at the Palo Alto VA Medical Illness Research, Education and Clinical Center, where she's the director of the Precision Medicine Core. Next, Ruth O'Hara is the Lowell W. and Josephine Q. Berry Professor at Stanford and is director of the Stanford Center for Clinical and Translational Research and Education. She is also the Senior Associate Dean of Research at the Stanford School of Medicine, and her work aims to develop and validate brain and mental health biomarkers amongst veterans, with a specific focus on PTSD, anxiety, bipolar disorder, and related conditions. And finally, Mike Snyder is the Stanford B. Ascherman Professor, Chair of Genetics, and Director of Genomics and Personalized Medicine at the Stanford School of Medicine. During his tenure at Stanford, the US News and World Report has ranked Stanford first or tied for first in genetics, genomics, bioinformatics under his leadership. He's also the founder of 8 biotech companies, including QBio and JanuaryAI. So an incredibly impressive group of people. So thank you again so much for joining us. So just to frame the session, Ruth, I wonder if I might turn to you first. Would you mind just explaining in expert terms what precision mental health is and how it changes the paradigm from the existing approaches to mental health?
Well, I think in the field of mental health, we've been particularly restricted and limited in our approaches because we haven't traditionally assessed multiple systems that could come together to give us more refined phenotypes of who might actually develop a psychiatric disorder, who might respond best to treatment. And in fact, I would say that one of the reasons that we recruited Dr. Leanne Williams to come to Stanford a decade ago and lead this effort is she was already doing this at the University of Sydney in Australia, and really recognizing that there were multiple components that converge when you're looking at an individual's physiological and mental phenotype. We're a self-report domain. Traditionally, the DSM-5, I think, took a lot of positive steps towards helping us clarify diagnosis in the field of psychiatric disorders. But it really is dominantly driven by a patient's own sense of their own well-being. And we don't include a range of biological markers. Indeed, one of the very few genetic markers now included in the DSM-5 is within the construct of restless leg syndrome, where there has been some validation. We are behind other disorders, and in part because we haven't had direct access to the tissue of interest, the brain. It's very hard to do that. So we're highly reliant on some of these novel approaches, such as functional neuroimaging, genomics, coming together among other domains to really give us a sense of the clusters of these physiological systems that go together to say that this individual's response or this individual's risk for developing PTSD or anxiety or depression is different, and we have a better path forward.
So one of the things that I think is incredibly interesting is in precision medicine more broadly. I think we've seen strides over the past couple of years. And Mike, I know this is an area that you have so much experience in. So I wonder if we could perhaps just start as well with where has precision medicine gone and from to in the past couple of years, and what lessons might we take from that for precision mental health?
Well, I'd say we're still in the very beginning, quite frankly. I think we're trying to understand the power of all these technologies like genomics and such. They're clearly being used in conditions for treating. They're not being used so much for, say, risk assessment and things like that, which I think is pretty important. But just stepping back a minute, the key to precision health and precision medicine is to really understand conditions. All these conditions are complex. And just to emphasize what Ruth was saying, one size doesn't fit all because they're not really one condition. There are many, many different conditions. That's what's wonderful about some of the work you'll hear from Leanne and others is that, you can subtype these conditions. And I think at some level, you want to subtype them all the way down to the individual. And so we can better understand what's going on for an individual, then you can actually prescribe the right treatment for the right person at the right time. I'm a perfect example of that. I'm type 2 diabetic, complex condition. We lump it all together as type 2 diabetes is one disease. It's not. It's probably 50 diseases. I don't think we know how many diseases it is. I don't respond to metformin. I don't respond to a lot of traditional drugs, but it turns out by getting data, I'm a data guy. So the more data you get, the more you can figure this stuff out and subtype diseases, and that you can actually make the right prescription. For me, it turns out there is a particular drug that I respond to very well, but you never would have guessed it if you just did the one size fits all sort of thing. So you really do have to, I think, we have to understand these conditions better, subtype them. I think we can do that with data and the new technologies that we'll probably spend some time on, like wearables and things. I hope we'll do that, but I think the neuroimaging stuff is super cool. And I think if we can subtype conditions, see how people are responding, we really need measurements. So you can see how people are responding and then treat them and then give them the right treatment for the right condition. That's a long-winded answer.
Right answer. Well, Leanne, I wonder if we could come to you, because I know this is a question that you've worked on a huge amount. Can I just pass the floor to you and just your general comments on this question of how do you start to develop more specific measurement?
Absolutely. Let me start by saying it's a pleasure to be here. It's been a mission of my life to change the paradigm for how we think about precision mental health. And it's very motivating to have a room of people, many organizations wanting to find solutions. Picking up on the theme of measurement, to me, that is one of the absolute essential aspects and what we need to really pin down the individual heterogeneity of these very complex conditions. My view is that currently we're waiting until what would be the equivalent of a stage 4 cancer. Like we're waiting until people are in crisis. And I believe that from the neuroscience and the technology innovation, we do have solutions that could make a difference now. And so it's really about how do we make actionable that hope and take those technologies into practice and really deploy them for people who are currently underserved. for the people who are struggling, trial and error of different interventions, or don't really have a way to know, am I at risk for a mental illness, or is this something that is related to stress in my life and I can manage? So having that early detection, getting people to the right treatment sooner rather than relying on a wait and see, multiple trials. So what we are developing or have developed and are now implementing and really seeking to scale is a new technology that will subtype. We refer to them as biotypes, different types of depression, anxiety, and other conditions, much like you would think of for all the remarkable work that you've done, Mike, and others, of subtyping types of cancer or heart disease, and therefore being able to inform the choice of treatment. And we may come back to some more specific examples later. But I should mention this really takes a village. So many collaborators, including the people on this panel. Jyoti is one of the contributors to our book on precision psychiatry. It really does take a multidisciplinary effort, partners across scales and different types of data.
Right. And on your behalf, I just want to plug your book, which is absolutely fascinating. So please, everybody, go and order a copy afterwards. So I
want a signed copy, actually.
Yes. We'll have a queue out the door later, Leanne. So I just want to change tack a little bit and start to talk about some of the really exciting areas of your own research beyond what we've talked about already. Jyoti, perhaps we could start with you, because I know you and your lab have been doing some really innovative work on neurotechnology, and really trying to monitor and map multiple aspects of cognition simultaneously. Could you just say a little bit about that work and why that's so important?
Sure. I'm really honored to be here today with this really distinguished panel. When they first called me, I was like, why am I part of this? That happens with many of us, right? So I grew up in India, and my family has a history of depression, schizophrenia, all in one family. I've seen mental illness at my door, within my family members, and also in the community that I've lived in. I got very enamored by the brain and really wanted to understand how our thoughts, emerge from all this activity that underlies it. Study that, and then wanted to be translational in terms of how do we translate that understanding towards improving cognitive health, brain health, productivity, efficiency, and as well as, leading every individual from this continuum that we go through on a day-to-day basis of, not feeling mentally fully present versus being mentally present. So all of us go through that continuum. There's no labels of one person has mental illness versus not. In our institutions today, we have many sophisticated methods, but like some of the distinguished speakers talked about, like especially Dr. Doty, we want to look at scalable technology. So one of the things that we do in our group is really look at EEG as a mobile technology that is paired with a lot of different digital assessments of cognition. Many of our neuroscience researchers really work in silos of what is attention, what is memory, what is emotion. But how about if we were able to look at all of those together? And how about if we could do that within a short period of time? Because we're thinking about the patient visit to the clinic. We're thinking about the community clinic. We're thinking about the primary health clinic. So our lab is really that energy, bringing engineers, mental health clinicians, neuroscientists together, as I'm sure Leanne's group is doing as well over here, is that bringing that energy that we want to bring scalable tools that are that can be employed in small period of time, and that can be not just limited to our institutions, but also allow me to work with global mental health communities in India, as well as, in global mental health, we talk about global health is local. So I work with communities such as today in California, one of the biggest crises is in the context of climate trauma, climate change. And that is being exacerbated by adverse childhood experiences. There's just so much to talk about. But what I want to bring to the table here is while we think about high-end approaches that cost a lot, we also have to think about how these methods get integrated with our primary communities and alongside wearables. What we're trying to do is see that cognition and neuroscientific understanding, as well as how our bodies respond, which wearables are telling us about our sleep, our stressors, our physical activity, together create the biotype for any given individual. We're really far from cluster approaches. We're really, neuroscience and these methods have done a lot of studies out there that work on group-based approaches. Person with depression has a certain genetic risk or a certain functional risk versus another, but where healthy people do not. But when a new person comes to the clinic, well, what are we going to do with them? We have to move to more N of one methods, and that's where all of these technologies come together, and we're excited to work on that.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And I just wanted to explore a little bit more. I know you've developed a new platform, a new technology called Brainy. Could you just say a little bit about how you're thinking about its use in finding therapeutic targets more broadly?
So what research has shown us that there really is no one holy grail of one biotype or one marker for any given mental illness. So what we want to do is use our tools so that we can get at multiple cognitive markers, like I mentioned, about how an individual is doing when they need to pay attention, when there's memory processes involved, emotional processes involved, distracted processes involved. Do these assessments in a brief period of time and get brain measures alongside, which in our case we do with EEG, and we model the brain imaging information much like we can get from brain networks, from fMRI, but we can do that not albeit to that spatial resolution, but to some resolution. And so we can get a very rich understanding of the cognitive as well as neural phenotype and type that an individual might have, and then apply that in sort of a multiple predictive model for understanding what might we target for that individual. What we found, what this understanding also helps us with, is also to improve the current standard of care, in that what I will add to that is that, say, one of our trials is using digital mindfulness alongside brain stimulation and in severely depressed people. And we find with and this is being done in clinics where there is no imaging. So we bring our tools to the clinics. And what we find is that, as an example, the biomarkers that change with the mindfulness are different from the biomarkers that change with brain stimulation, but they're complementary, and together they produce greater patient recovery than either of those methods would do alone. So the biomarkers can help us target new treatments to patients, but also help us unravel why certain people get better with synergistic new complementary approaches that are out there.
Thank you so much. Ruth, I wondered if I could turn to you again. I know much of your work looks across the full age spectrum, including both normal and disordered aging. Could you just talk a little bit about your work on cognitive functioning in older adults as it relates to mental health?
Absolutely, something I'm experiencing personally every day now as I enter some of my latter decades. All of us, as we age, experience deficits in cognition, our information processing systems. So actually, the research that has been done in the domain of aging is a very good model for looking at cognition across the lifespan. Of course, typically the focus in older adults is on the risk for dementia, but in fact, many individuals have, as they age, what we call chronic cognitive impairment, that it never develops into a neurodegenerative disorder, but actually does impact well-being in a day-to-day basis and functionality for older adults. We are increasingly recognizing that, in fact, good cognitive health with age really contributes to a more positive attitude to what we call better successful aging. Indeed, several years ago, we collaborated with the University of San Diego, an excellent leader in geriatric psychiatry, Dilip Jeste, who heads the Stein Institute for Aging. And we looked at an in-depth self-report survey of the factors with age that were most important to individuals and to their well-being. And actually, the single most important factor was good cognition. It was less physical health. And it subserves so many aspects of our life. We have a tendency to forget that, whether we're going to an event and remembering names, whether we're managing just the day-to-day activities of structuring and organizing our lives, deficits in those domains as we age can really have a significant impact. I think what's been exciting, and sadly as a result of the pandemic, for many years, the individuals and expertise around assessment of cognition in late life really felt we couldn't do this digitally. It just wasn't going to be possible. And with COVID, we had to assess individuals who are at risk for cognitive impairment and decline remotely and digitally. It has worked out actually to be much more effective and much more feasible than any of us thought. So I think the models within late life really speak to good approaches that we could be implementing across the lifespan in a more effective way to track in real time cognitive processing that's so essential and key to all we do.
Can I ask the obvious question everybody's wondering? How do I get good cognition?
Well, it's a great question. So, for most individuals as they age, there are about 3 or 4 cognitive domains that really take a decline. And those declines are secondary to physiological impairments such as reduced hippocampal volume, which is the key area that subserves memory, or prefrontal cortex, or the connections among regions of the brain are negatively impacted with the age-related physiological events, particularly neuroinflammation and many others. And some of these actually, Mike, are secondary to some of the disorders that you've mentioned, such as type 2 diabetes or cardiovascular disease. The ones that seem to most negatively impact function are attentional deficits, what we call executive function deficits, and memory deficits. Memory deficits are very perturbing to individuals because they feel that they cannot manage their day-to-day. Organizational deficits are sometimes not well assessed by the individual themselves, but actually are core and key to such psychiatric disorders as late life depression. In fact, they're core symptoms of those disorders. So, traditionally, there's been a literature that suggests it's very important to do crossword puzzles, and the New York Times would be a good measure of that. I think that's wholly inadequate with the task at hand. I mean, that would be particularly for individuals who now have so many cognitive activities they engage in day to day, and particularly the devices we use and the computers we use. To me, that's a little like taking someone who is a triathlon athlete and telling them they can walk around the block when they get older and retire, and they'll be able to sustain that good level of function. So we did actually a study many years ago where we compared MDs who were actually taking a course on golfing with older adults who were taking a course on structured writing, where they actually had to hand in essays, they had to be scored. This was along the line of the famous Nunn study, which found that the density of ideas and language complexity and grammatical complexity were indicators early in life of actually dementia. And what we found was we actually judged essays, and we had the MDs who were in this golfing class do the same. And they were all older, all over 65. And the individuals undergoing that very focused course to actually teach and learn did much better, as we would expect, than their actually highly educated counterparts. I think this is a whole domain that we need to consider, because everything flows, in my view, from actually the cognition, particularly from a mental health well-being perspective.
Thanks, Ruth. And I should say, we're going to hold some time for questions towards the end. So if there's stuff that's burning, please do jot it down, put a pin in it, and we'll come back in just a couple of minutes and try and open up the conversation and make this a real debate as we go through. Before we do that, Mike, I just wanted to come back to you because I know you've published a paper quite literally hot off the press in the past couple of weeks with some of the most exciting areas of innovation in this space, I think with Ariel. Could you just say a little bit about what stood out to you when you were drafting?
Yeah, she's going to talk about this later, so I'll be super brief. But basically, we had folks do the Tony Robbins intervention, and we, did depression scores before and after, and all the way out to 12 months. And remarkably, maybe not some people, for you guys, it's all expected, but people actually retained very, very good scores, 90%, all the way out for 12 months later. So again, she'll talk more about that later. So we want to do some follow-up studies to actually do the kinds of things we're generally known for, which is dive a lot deeper, like see what's going on physiologically with the wearables. We have new methods of measuring biochemistry using microsampling that want to go just much, much deeper. So we really want to dig into this in a lot more detail to see exactly what's going on. And there's always responders and non-responders, back to the personalization standpoint. So you want to understand who responds, who doesn't respond. And so there's some folks here, Zeev and Shahar, you'll get a chance to meet, who actually like to push this along. So these are the sorts of things, and that's just one type of intervention. We would like to try this with other sorts of interventions as well, and see, again, try and get to personalize responses and see how they're working and see how long they last and exactly what's going on.
Great, thank you. Excited to hear more later. And Leanne, I just wondered, I was reading some of your work from a couple of years ago, and this really interesting, these really interesting aspects around participants assessing their early life stresses and how that impacted the accuracy of the neural circuit biotypes when it came to predicting who was going to respond to antidepressants who had depression. I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about that and this intersection between understanding someone's life history and biotypes and why that matters.
Absolutely. So this example that you're highlighting, Jess, it comes from a study that I led that, to our knowledge, is the first precision medicine study for depression. And it in the study, we collected a range of different measures. So we were asking about people's life history, their cognition, EEG, and where possible, we actually scanned their brain using a functional MRI, looking at a kind of a stress test for the brain at rest and then during different tasks. And I think it speaks to the theme of the panel that we really need this integrated approach. One of the striking findings from the study, and this study was run across 5 different countries, so it was a reasonably representative sample. And a striking finding, regardless of country, age, or any other demographic, was that people reporting with depression had up to 4 times more early life trauma that they were self-reporting. What's kind of confronting, but I think many people working in the field see this day after day, is that much of that early life trauma was before the age of 12, and it was about quite serious traumatic experiences of neglect and abuse. And what stood out from that is this is a domain that we don't ordinarily measure, but it's actually quite measurable and could be a kind of early detection or screening, or the part of the early screening, which is done in other areas of health. As many as you would know, adverse childhood events are considered for other areas of health. The next piece of the puzzle that really got us more to personalization was, first, we saw that the individuals who had experienced the early life trauma, they were the ones who accounted for the very vast majority of people who don't respond to any antidepressant. And I thought that's incredibly important information to know, because these were people who had gone through up to 9 trials of different antidepressants. And in brain imaging, one kind of frightening observation is that it may actually be causing a deterioration of the brain if you're on the wrong treatment. So that was the first observation. The second was that we found we could predict that response or non-response and then fine-grained, could you achieve remission, if we took into account the brain circuit that responds and regulates emotion. And in particular, emotion that is a fear kind of response, like the fear response you have when you experience trauma. So this led us to identify a particular biotype of depression that we call threat dysregulation. It is where trauma may be one of the factors that is unresolved and contributing to a change and interaction with brain circuits, such that the brain is staying in a kind of alarm mode. And that combination was the highest and most cross-validated, accurate prediction of unlikely to respond to any of these antidepressants. So that's an underserved group that we consider really are suitable to alternative approaches that directly target the trauma and this brain circuit. And that's one example. There are other examples of the biotypes there. You may be thinking, well, how is this scalable? I mean, given the enormous cost of an untreated depression and other disorders, we could argue that the upfront cost of getting it right is justifiable. But thinking about scale along the lines of you were highlighting, Jyoti, that trauma response that we see in the brain, we can also measure from peripheral responses, like wearables and cortisol measures. So we're looking at making those correlations in ongoing work.
Can I add something?
Please do, yeah.
You know, Leanne brought a striking vision when she came to Stanford that really has had huge impact. But one of the particular pieces of information she underscored is we may have enough information to start doing this already. We have a tendency in the field of mental health to wait for sort of the panacea, the magic bullet. And actually, we've so much information that we can probably do this, even with the functional neuroimaging directly. And this was really a perspective that we were not thinking about when we recruited Leanne. It's been a tremendous perspective to say we have these biotypes already, the information to construct these biotypes. We have the information on the key and core circuits that she's just talked about. In fact, she had a fabulous paper in Lancet Psychiatry in 2019, that 16, that is really highlights the core circuits that we should be thinking about and advancing on precision mental health right now.
So I think just building off of that and this question around scalability, what are the barriers that we're going to have to address in order for this to be widely used in clinical practice? I'd love everyone's take on this, but Jyoti, perhaps we could start with you.
I think, I think we're going to do this. I'm thinking part of the design exercise that we go through today later is that we have to stop thinking in silos, right? It's a group of people, the engineers and the neuroscientists come together along with clinicians, and the clinicians tell us the barriers that I only have 15 minutes for and this kind of an appointment. And what can you do in that? What is the most you can do in 15 minutes? And then the neuroscientists will say, well, for an attentional task, we need blah, blah, blah signal to noise ratio. And that means the person needs to do this n times over. And then, then the engineer will say, how about we do it in 1/10 of the time and see how to enhance signal to noise with engineering methods. And so we kind of go around the circle in our groups and then work with community partners to say, what are the barriers? What are the other barriers that that are impediments? And some of the speakers today in this energy around digital tools and also gamification is that they allow for our tools to be not just limited to expert workers. So we've trained social workers, we've trained healthcare workers, we've trained people who know nothing about neuroscience in some of the tools that we create, and they're creating EEG data on a day-to-day basis, and people feel like they're playing, literally playing games while they are doing tasks of attention and memory and so on. And so these are enjoyable assessments from a gaming standpoint. And at the same time, when this group comes together. Now the community worker knows, hey, I was able to enhance prefrontal function. Hey, I was able to suppress a default mode network, mind wandering activity. And that kind of objective knowledge sometimes is an extra level of empowerment that our community leaders need to say, hey, it's not just that I'm telling you I can show you this information. So that constant dialogue is very important. It's not just done in silos. And I think that's how we're going to advance access to these tools. And I'm sure my panelists have more thoughts on this.
Yeah, Ruth, Mike, sorry, would you like to jump in next?
Well, I can jump in. I mean, I'd like to see us do more early detection. I think monitoring through, again, that's probably why we do all the wearables. Paul, you aren't running around naked without smartwatches and things, but I really think there's a lot of opportunity. It's not just wearables, it's how you interface with your electronics, meaning your phone, your searches, your things. We can collect a lot of information that can give early signs of what's going on. And then we can take more preventative interactions. I love the behavioral modifications, which I think can actually also be done web-based. I know human are important in this space, and I don't want to undermine that concept. I think it's really, really important, but I think we can do a lot more to scale this by going beyond just human interventions. By the way, you were just saying, behavioral modification through apps. How are you going to reach all these 98% of people in Wyoming who don't have access? It's going to be hard to just drop people in to have that human contact. I don't think it's going to work that way in the future. And with telemedicine and things, we have new opportunities. I think we really should be thinking creatively how to get the right interactions, the right people. And they're going to be very, very personalized, right? Nobody's behavior is the same. So we would just have to see what works. And you can build algorithms around all this simple, on every person, you can collect enough data to see what their trajectories look like. Whether we do a lot in the physical health space for infectious disease, but there's no reason not to do that for mental health and then take appropriate interventions. I'll just add one last comment. There's very, very few fields that are preventative, and dentistry is one of them, right? That's a relatively new field. It's only like 100 years old, maybe 120, something like that, where people brush their teeth in order to prevent cavities. So I think ultimately we've got to get in that direction where we're doing brushing our teeth for our minds and for our bodies so that we're actually preventing adverse outcomes before they happen. And I think that's going to be a lot easier to maintain. And, our ultimate goal is have people live long, healthy lives and then just die, right? That's how we should be operating, extend our health span. So that's what I'd like to see happen in all areas.
Great. I really love the dentistry analogy. That's really, really helpful. Ruth, perhaps we can come to you, then Leanne, and then I'll open it up to the floor for questions and conversation.
I think Mike is right on target, the early prevention. And I think also we have to still fight the battle of stigma in mental health. One of the advantage of using digital technologies is that it allows people to, if they're not feeling quite themselves from a well-being or a depression perspective, they have some anxiety, it allows people to engage in sort of behavioral modifications or tracking that is not the same as confronting these issues with a therapist. So it's a kind of middle step, is it, or between step? And I think if we can do more to encourage people to start considering their well-being at a very, very early stage. I'll tell you, we did a study at the other end of the developmental spectrum that we published last year in a comparison of lower socioeconomic school environment in which we placed a mindfulness activity during their physical education classes. These were third graders to fifth graders. And then we assessed their sleep. It was a sleep-focused study. And we compared it with a similar lower socioeconomic status school in which individuals did not receive the intervention. And we wouldn't even call it an intervention, it was really a didactic. And astonishingly, over a period of a year, we were absolutely surprised to see a dramatic improvement in sleep in those who were getting mindfulness training during their physical education. Some of the comments from the children speak to this end of one that Mike is such a proponent of, where they would say, We teach our parents to take deep breaths and not shout when they're angry. I mean, they were actually not only modifying for themselves stress, but actually helping the whole family. And so starting early and starting in a way that these become exactly as Mike is suggesting, as routine processes, as brushing your teeth, I think that's the way to really improving mental health and well-being. It's tremendous. And digital technologies and the expertise of the people on the panel, I think, and their teams and their centers across the country and their collaborators could really get us there.
Leanne, any final thoughts on barriers?
I think I'd like to echo these thoughts. I think they're so important, and then highlight this idea of really introducing early into schools, like understanding how your own brain works. Yeah. Like we learn about most other systems early, we learn about basic kind of physical safety. So I think a barrier is how do we get this information into the general community, into the education system, so that I can learn about my brain health and strategies that might help the prevention that you highlighted, all the way through the continuum to when it may become something in which you do need more proactive support. That then also applies in the health system, that the whole flow from community, like the first contact, all the way through to when you get more into tertiary care, which will also be addressing a barrier, which is training the next generation of professionals and community organizations involved in this continuum of mental health through wellness.
Right. Well, thank you, all of you, so much. This has been illuminating and incredibly wonderful to hear from you all. So I'm going to hand the floor back over to Ben Rolnick. But before then, if everyone could put their hands together and say a big thank you.